Sometimes I love her too much, right?
What they doing coming in the back door?
They're side door, Christian. Morning. Because it's cold. They don't want to. Good morning, sir. Morning. How are you?
Yeah, that looks like that.
Hey, Bubba.
That looks about like the one that professor I had, he had purchased when he was in Italy. He said, beware of professors with fancy leather backpacks.
Well, I thought that looked respectful. If I had
It
to take
does. His purse.
There you go, man purse.
He needs it. He needs a strap. We can wear it like that. Yeah.
I've never been
What you sitting in the back door for? You ashamed to come in the front?
I have parts on the other side of the street.
Well, you need to have something that you
scared
Well,
to
he
death.
would.
tell him to come in the back door. You need to make a grand entrance.
Ta-da.
There you go. We'll get some trumpets and play some trumpets.
What do you think of that is?
Yeah, we will.
Fast, but expensive to pay them.
Just something, but he did it like when she was petting him. Jerked his head right in her.
Popular by design.
Christmas?
Well, it was a NATO gun.
Yeah, but just
But
like
actually, it was a NATO gun for P4.
I don't know if JP's coming today or not.
Speed.
JP's coming today or not. So we'll
I've
just
heard
wait
several
and see.
people say that the
I never know.
reason they have that because
Year-old young
the
man.
German
That was
go
called
that
that first started, and they were there for and she was still legging and bumping a little bit. And he didn't get confused or he, whatever,
Yes.
he wrote it out.
Okay. I've heard several people say that.
It's neat.
Yeah, but you can only do that with armor piercing. It'll go through it without armor piercing.
Yeah, like a Kevlar. 22 magnum.
Really?
Yes, sir.
I was just watching a guy on YouTube shoot.
That has one. Wes has one.
I just want to play, love it, pet it, squeeze it.
Like $50 a box.
It's, I think it's similar to practice.
Burnt your hand. Oh, man.
Yeah, I think they said only got about 60% of the energy of an iPhone.
But then you go right.
Like not a nice soft, not like
So it won't
that
go
one.
through
Oh,
but it'll go through the chemicals. You know, like the plate.
Right. That's why.
So maybe we should, you know, I'll follow.
no,
Next guy, I love it. But maybe that's the right answer. Maybe that's the answer. Man, you're all of a sudden liberals to say something like that.
No, don't say that.
no.
Don't say that. Hey, good morning.
Did y'all
How are you?
But I'm just saying. I think a lot of them registered. I think if I sell mine, we should have to go to the police station. Go back there. That's my.
It would make sense. But
But
people that don't care, law in place.
that's true. But it makes it more difficult for them to get it unless they. Oh, yeah. I'm reading the PCs. I don't know that they buy illegal section.
She knew.
They might buy them, but they buy them from some, they buy them from a company.
Like my boss, my mom, let her daughter raise her. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like the oh, so, and then they mix it with well, and I've also learned my boss's daughter did the 100 jumpers and all that, all the English stuff, and now they're trying to transition to even though they're that kind of thing. And so they're switching to the Western, and maybe let them do some of that, but it's like, what, one of the differences? You don't have a dime age there, and it's literally the rule that they're going to shoot. That's the Western world. We don't want any, they don't want any of that. You better come ready to work. Oh, man. First time ever, first time on the horse. I'm gonna get out of this dude's way. That is? It's a saddlebag. What you talking about?
It's a purse.
It's a merce.
I love it. It's a backpack.
And that looks like Doris. Doesn't that look like Doris? Yeah, see, this is. Do you tell him he carries a bigger purse than you?
I guarantee you mine cost about a fifth of hers.
Yeah, but you went quantity over quality.
That's right. I love it. Good for you.
Good morning. If you would, open your Bible to the book of Exodus, chapter 63, verse 3. Too soon?
You say 63 verses?
63, verse 3. Some of us watched the game yesterday.
I turned it off at half.
Well, that's a definition, isn't it? We can have a wordplay on that. Tell me if this sounds familiar. A bunch of people from another country move into your own. They don't look like you. They don't speak the same language. They don't have the same culture. They work labor-intensive, menial jobs that the natives look down on. They work in agriculture, they work in construction, and they work in domestic service jobs. Sound familiar? The population has grown to the point it's become a matter of national concern. When we read these stories in the Bible, one of the challenges that we should do is put ourselves, as Wes preached a lesson on, put ourselves in the story. But put ourselves in on all sides. Don't identify with just the victims. Don't identify with the heroes only. Look at the bad guys and see if you got anything in common with them. Exodus is one of the most important books in the Bible. You know, probably after the Gospels maybe after Acts, after Genesis, you got to put Exodus up there. Genesis tells us that God is the creator and that he's the all-powerful. But Exodus tells us who he really is, who he is as a person, what he thinks about injustice, what he thinks about his followers. Exodus is one of the most quoted books in the Bible, probably behind Psalms. Depends on who you ask. And quoting gets a little fuzzy because sometimes you have a direct quote, sometimes you have an allusion, and sometimes you just have a repeated theme. Exodus is the foundation for the rest of the Bible. In our Bible, the title to this book is Exodus. It means the way out. And the title to our book comes from the Septuagint Greek version of the Bible. The Septuagint named it Exodus. The text of our book comes from the Masoretic text, which is about 1,000 years older than the Septuagint. So our title comes from one book, our text comes from another. In the Hebrew Bible, the title to this book is These Are the Names, because it's a reference in chapter 1 when he reads the names of or lists the names of the patriarchs. Who wrote the book of Exodus? Moses. Multiple times in the Pentateuch, and by the way, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, they're one book. The first word in the Hebrew Bible in Exodus is the word and. It's just continuing on from the last verse of the book of Genesis. But going back to Moses as the author, multiple times in the Pentateuch, it states that he wrote something down. Kevin, would you read for us Exodus 24, 3 and 4?
So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said, we will do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. And he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel.
I'm not going to, if anyone wants to discuss documentary hypothesis, let me know. It was a theory that was in favor. I don't think it's in favor anymore, but it was a theory that 5 people wrote portions of each book of the Pentateuch, that it wasn't just Moses. I don't believe that it's in favor anymore. I don't intend to talk about it any more than that. But there are some clues in the text that it was written by an eyewitness. Lori, would you read from Exodus chapter 15 and verse 27?
After leaving Mara, the Israelites traveled on to the oasis of Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there beside the water.
All right, so why would that detail be in there if the author of the book wasn't an eyewitness? I don't believe that there's an explanation for that other than someone that was there recorded this. There are some problems though. I personally believe Moses authored the first 5 books of the Bible. I don't know if he wrote every verse. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, I believe it's 34. Let me put my glasses on. Yeah, 34. We have the account of Moses' death and burial. I don't know that he wrote about his own death, okay, or his own burial. The detail that God personally buried him. In another place in the book, it's recorded that in Numbers 12 and verse 3, it's recorded that Moses was the most humble person on earth. I don't know that the most humble person on earth would write that about himself. It could be that someone like Joshua added the details of Moses' death. And maybe someone added the detail about him being the most humble. It's kind of hard to be the most humble and then say you're the most humble.
Unless it's true.
You and Henry have a lot in common. So that's the authorship. So then we get into the dating. And there's 2 possible dates here. There's an early date, which I subscribe to, and there's a later date, which was in the Charlton Heston movie. The early date puts the date of this around 1440, and there's some evidence for that. The later date puts this around 1220 or so, and there's some evidence for that. We're not going to resolve it here today, but I'll lay out the dating. For those who believe in the later date, the book of Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 lists the names of 2 cities. The name of one is Pithom, and the name of the second is Ramses. Because the name is Ramses, and Ramses was in the 1200 BC era, they believe that this is an indication for the later date. They've done some archaeological digs at places that they believe can be identified as these 2 cities. And the archaeological evidence seems to suggest that they were built in the later date. But the opponents to that would say it was not uncommon for a pharaoh to rebuild a city and then rename it after himself. Evidence for the early date can be found in the scripture. 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 states that the Exodus occurred 480 years before the 4th year of Solomon's reign. And the evidence from the scripture and from archaeological evidence from Assyria puts that date around 966. Well, if you add 480 to 966, you're at 1446. In Judges 11:26, Jephthah said that the Israelites had been living in the regions of Palestine for nearly 300 years. Well, Jephthah lived around 1100 BC. You add 300 to 1100, They're at 1400 BC is when they entered the land. There was a pharaoh in the 1200s after Ramses who had an inscription describing a great victory he had over Israelites living in the land of Canaan. But he lived after Ramses. And it said that they were settled, that they weren't nomadic anymore. Well, that seems to suggest that the earlier date is in view here because they've already left Egypt. They're already settled. If you want to look at this some more on your own, there is a good study Bible out there called the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. And one of the authors of it is John Walton. And Walton is probably the foremost authority on Genesis and Exodus, and a huge authority for anything through the captivity. He will challenge you on some things, but he has a great belief in the earlier date, and he is a Hebrew language scholar and cultural background scholar, so he has a lot of evidence to his arguments. How much do you know about the book of Exodus? Raise your hand. Tell me. Name somebody. Name an Egyptian by name out of the book of Exodus. Anybody?
I had a comment on the author and the date.
Okay.
If you look at 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, that kind of puts it looped for every book in the Bible. All scripture is given by the inspiration of God, so nobody was there at creation, so God has to be there in the Bible as far as an inspiration of all of these books.
I agree. Anyone got a name for an Egyptian in Exodus? There isn't one. Exodus never names an Egyptian by name. They refer to Pharaoh and they refer to different people, but they never name an Egyptian by name. Why do you think that is? We'll come back to that. Name for me some leaders of Israel in the book of Exodus. Well, one of them ought to be pretty easy. All right, Moses. We're down one. All right. Moses, Aaron, Joshua appears. Anybody else?
Her,
Who?
wasn't he a brother?
I don't know. That's a good question. He's definitely in the Pentateuch. I don't remember if he's in her. If he's in Exodus or not, I don't recall.
I'm just guessing.
The Bible names 3 leaders. Who's the third leader? Miriam.
I was gonna say their sister.
Miriam's described as a leader. She's also described as a prophet. Pharaoh isn't named. We're going to jump ahead for a little bit. But in the first chapter, who's named? Say it. I can't hear you.
Israelites.
Israelite. But what are their names?
Sons of Jacob.
Okay. I overlooked them, but you're right. Further down in the story, who's named? Around verse 12 or so. Okay, here, let me scroll down because I forget how to pronounce their names.
In 15, Shiphrah and Puah.
That's it. So we don't name Pharaoh, but we named these two ladies. For one story, for one account, that's about 5 or 6 verses long, they're recorded forever. Now, it's not unusual. In the early part of the book, until we get to in the early part of the Bible, we don't oftentimes have the names of foreign leaders recorded unless they're like a Rephaim or something during the conquest. Now, when we get later into the divided kingdom and we start having like Sennacherib and Nebuchadnezzar and those people, they're named. But why do you think they're in Exodus, Pharaoh isn't named? Go ahead.
He must not have been significant to God.
Okay. Who is the central character in Exodus? I think it's God. I think this book is all about God. Moses is there to repeat what God says, to do what God says. But I think the book's about God. Chapter 1 is about reminding the audience that God has been working even though you haven't heard from him. And God's going to, one of the themes in the Bible, or the themes in the book of Exodus, is God's going to have to reveal himself in different ways again, much like he revealed himself to Abraham when the 3 visitors came and they were going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And they had that discussion about how many, if there's only 10 righteous people, would you destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And God's revealing himself to Abraham. Well, through Exodus, God is revealing himself again. And he's going to reveal himself as the God of creation when he's going through these plagues. But he's also going to wind up revealing to everyone that he's the God, the deliverer, God, the redeemer, God of the children of Israel, God of gods, because he's going to wind up defeating all the gods of the Exodus. Of the Egyptians. The structure of the book, well, let's talk about some of the themes. One of the challenges of going through Exodus is there anyone here that hasn't been through Exodus before? Is there anyone in here that hasn't been through Exodus 4 or 5 times? We're familiar with it. But sometimes our familiarity can keep us from seeing everything. And, I had a discussion with Dan. This is an aside. But I had a discussion with Dan because I was going back through, starting over my reading cycle. And I tripped across something in the book of Genesis regarding the flood I never picked up on before. I've been through Genesis a few times, but there was something there that stood out to me because I was taking it in audibly instead of reading it. It just, something about that difference, it just jumped out at me. One of the challenges I'm going to try to do is get us to look at things maybe in a perspective we haven't seen them before. To see if there's something new that we can look at. There are some lesser themes. I call them lesser because they're not the big thing to me, to Exodus. God revealing himself. I don't know if I'd call that lesser or not, but I listed it under the lesser. He reveals himself to Moses, to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians, the Israelites, and the other nations in this book. We have stuff here talked about the oppression and exploitation and persecution of a people. there's some prejudice here. We have slavery and genocide. Kind of modern terms, at least genocide, to an ancient problem, but it was still there. We have civil disobedience. We have injustice. We've got God's provision of order to an anxious people. And I think that's one that's overlooked a lot. Put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites as they're leaving Egypt. And do they fight their way out? No, do they? No. What do?
They spoil the Egyptians.
They what?
They spoil the Egyptians. They take all the gold and the Egyptians give it to them.
They give it to them. But how would you describe them once they've left the city?
Wandering.
How about fleeing? What's their attitude when they're at the Red Sea before God through Moses parts the Red Sea?
They were fearful.
What did they ask him?
Let us out here to die.
Did you leave us out here to die?
Their caravan gets attacked a couple of different times, doesn't it?
And there's multiple instances. Was there no bread in Egypt that you brought us out here? We're thirsty. We can't drink this water. And we can read this with the eyesight of knowing the end of the story and going, this is a really ungrateful people. But you got to realize they weren't nomads until they left Egypt. They were beaten, they were worked hard, but they knew where they were going to lay down. They knew where their next meal was coming from, and they knew they had something to drink. They had order. And then when they get into the wanderings, all of that's taken away. And that's how God teaches them faith. So the book of Genesis, we read it through one set of eyes, but one thing that John Walton kind of points out is one of the purposes of Genesis, and who's the first audience to read or hear Genesis? It's these Israelites that are in the wilderness. They're the first ones. And one of the purposes of Genesis is to explain to the Israelites that God is a God of order. That what you see as chaos, he is in control of. And that you should put your trust in him because he's got this. That's part of the purpose of what's going on here too. And he's got to explain this to them over and over again. Exodus can be divided a couple different ways. It can be divided in 3 sections based upon chapters 1 through 19, persecution, plagues, and the power of God. 20 through 24, precepts and commandments. 25 through 40, construction of the tabernacle in the presence of God. Another way of looking at this is salvation, education, and fellowship. Do we know everything we need to know before we're saved? We know enough to be saved, but that's it. So we're saved. And then we learn some do's and don'ts, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to walk as a Christian, to live as a Christian, and to worship as a Christian, and how to develop a relationship with God. That's the format of this book. It can also be divided geographically. First 12 chapters, where are the Israelites, the Hebrews? They're in Egypt. 13 through 18, where are they? To where? Where are they headed, 13 through 18? They're headed to Mount Sinai. Then 19 through 40, which is about 2 years' time, they're at Sinai. That much of the book is at Sinai. I think this is a key passage. Dan, would you read for us 19, 4 through 6?
You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites.
He saved them. He demands their obedience. And if they do it, he has a relationship with them. One author said, the story of Exodus is designed to tell us what God is like, how he thinks of his people, the lengths to which he will go to deliver them, and the proper response of God's people to their God. In a second, we'll roll right into chapter 1. What I aim to do, there's 40 chapters here. There's 20 chapters at Sinai. I aim to cover as much ground as we can in a lesson. Lord willing, we'll get through 4 chapters by the end of Wednesday. When we get to the plagues, my plan is, we'll see how, it's a plan. I might try to do all the plagues in one sitting. Because, is there a significant spiritual difference between the plague of flies and the plague of gnats? There really isn't. If we see some things through there that we want to camp on and dwell on, we can. If somebody has a question that we want to work on, we can do that. But it's not my intent to make this study a test of our endurance, but rather get out of it what we need to get out of it, and hopefully bring out some high points and maybe some things we haven't discussed along the way. Genesis chapter 1 is, and the other thing, I'm telling you now that Wednesday, if I can, I'd like to try to get through the first 4 chapters. We may only get through the first 2. I'm going to assume you read it. Because the way I prepare gets worse and worse as time goes on. I probably have 30 commentaries. And I try to drink through a fire hydrant. And then I try to put all this down into some coherent structure for class. It would be hard sometimes to get all that material out if we read every verse in class. There'll be verses that we will read for multiple reasons. One, to make a point, two, to break up the monotony in the class. But reading every verse of every chapter in class, I don't know is the best use of our time, especially since we're supposed to be reading our Bibles anyway. It doesn't take a lot of time. If you have an audio Bible, you can listen to 4 chapters in less than 10 minutes. Very easily. So, anyone have any comments or suggestions just based on that?
I don't know if this we're gonna go Wednesday, and we won't be here, so it's kind of a simple, but it's that Moses wrote this. And this book and this revelation of God is a response, like God showing up, like as you read through 1 and 2, is him responding to the cries of their oppression. Mm-hmm. And so what did they know of God? Like, this is we're getting the first 5 books. We're getting the stories of creation. What was the oral history? What did they know about God? Because it's getting written down for them now, and it's getting written and supplied. Like you said, it's like God's teaching them on a God of order as they hear, and Moses is writing Genesis. I don't know, it's just it's fascinating where they are, and then now Revelation is starting.
And some of them did have an idea of who he was, maybe not to the extent he wanted them to know, but the midwives did not obey Pharaoh, we'll see in chapter 1. Why?
Feared God.
They feared God. When God reveals himself to Moses, he identifies himself not just as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the God of your father. So Moses' father was a believer in God. So God had not disappeared from the eyes of, or the minds of the Israelites completely. Wes?
In a simple way, and this is my simple mind, Moses is the beginning of the Mosaical age.
Yeah.
And before that, the patriarch. So if God spoke to the patriarchs, Terah, okay, Abraham's father, anybody that would be a patriarch, what about Job even? So to me, you'd say what their knowledge was of God would have been just handed down. Like we do things from family to family, our generations hand things down from people that we didn't even know in our family.
I want to know how much he told Abraham. I want to know how, you know what I mean? Like, what were those conversations like? Or was it, you know what I mean? Like, to me, that's the value of, we rely so heavily on revelation. We are people of the book. And this is the book being written, and it's being written and written down in response to people that have been slaves for, you know what I mean? I don't know, it's a fascinating thought that this is where Revelation begins.
Well, there's an oral tradition outside the scripture. We don't have the name of Pharaoh's daughter, but Josephus records the name for her. In Timothy, we have the name of the 2 sorcerers who opposed Moses. Their name's not in Exodus. And you can say, well, he was divinely inspired. Well, okay, great. But the only way this works is if his audience knows that was their names also. So there's an oral tradition outside the recorded scripture. While the time remains, I'll give you a little more detail about the timing, according to John Walton and others. In verse 8 of chapter 1, there's a new Pharaoh. According to some commentators, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, the word new there could be one of 2 different, or another scholar, or whatever, or another Pharaoh. The word there, they had 2 words for that. a new as new of the same, or new as different. Not the same. And the word there apparently is different. Walton says that when Joseph went into Egypt, and apparently Egypt's like every other country, at times Egyptians didn't rule it. And when Joseph went in, the Hyksos or Hyksos, or however you say their name, people had invaded and conquered and ruled Egypt. They were Semitic herdsmen from Canaan. And the Hyksos, or however it basically means shepherd rulers, something like that, shepherd kings. They ruled. They would have been favorable to Joseph and his family because Joseph and his family were also Semitic peoples and that worked with livestock. So they're kind of welcomed in. And then shortly before the Exodus, chronologically, the Egyptians retake control. And so this Pharaoh looks around and he goes, we got all these Semitic people in here. We need to get rid of them because it's the same type of people that they just defeated. And so that makes a certain amount of sense. Walton lays it out a lot better than I do because he's a lot more knowledgeable than I am. So if that's something you're interested in looking at, look at that. But if you follow that timeline, then one thing all the pharaohs did when they named themselves is they named themselves after a god. And so Ramses, the last half of the word after the RA, for lack of better pronunciation, Moses, to the Egyptians meant son. Ramses would be Ra, the god of the sun, son. The pharaohs were considered gods, just like Caesar was deified as a god in Revelation. Well, at the time, if you follow Walton's timeline, it's not just his, it's the whole early crowd. If you follow his, the Pharaoh that would have been in charge, which is also Josephus's view, his name was Thutmoses. And I'm messing that all up. Son of the serpent god. Now, that kind of appeals to my view of how this all looks. Was it him? I don't know. It could have been Seti the first. It could have been Ramses the second. There are two other possibilities out there. But that's kind of the viewpoint for that story. Before we get into one, we'll start one Wednesday because we're getting short on time. Any comments, any questions, anything you want me to get into as we go through it? Yeah.
We have time to talk about like Egypt even knowing their own history. Like, do we know how much time between Joseph and then it says this guy didn't know anything. Joseph didn't need anything to know. Do we?
Let me answer it a different way. Let me answer a different question because you mentioned time. There's a parallel here between this and the New Testament. Joseph and his family, or Jacob and his family go into Israel, go into Egypt. I'll get it straight in a second. How long are they there? 400 years. They're in there 430 years, and we'll get into that a little bit more Wednesday night. So there's been silence from God, no revelation for how long? 430 years. The children of Israel come out of the Babylonian captivity. We have a few more books written. The last one is Malachi. The next one is Matthew. What's the time span between Malachi and Matthew? 440 years before there's another revelation from God. The parallels between Exodus and the Gospels are just going to be all over. There's just going to be tons and tons and tons. And you got to be careful when you're reading it, because there's this one guy I was listening to. When you don't see well, you'll listen a lot more. And he was trying to make parallels between the bush and the sandals. So you got to be careful. Some things aren't textually committed, but some things kind of just jump out at you. And why I never picked up on that 400 years before this week, I didn't read that one. It just kind of jumped out at me. It's like, well, wait a minute. God speaks to Joseph. They go into Egypt. We don't have anything else recorded until 430 years later. Same thing happened between the two testaments.
Well, it fits because Jesus, one like Moses, is going to appear, so that's parallel.
Yeah.
So we're introducing his character.
Anything else? I'll have some discussion questions next week, but I just wanted to do an overview today. If you got anything you want me to prepare for or look at, just get with me and I'll be glad to do it. We'll stand down at this time.
We purged the virus. I know that has to be miserable. It's good to have y'all back. I don't even want to know. That is no bueno.
Was that the stomach one?
Yeah.
Look, I'm sorry. All of y'all had it? Y'all big